Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ilana Redstone. She's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her current work focuses on campus climate and viewpoint diversity, and she's the author of a recent book, Unassailable Ideas: How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education. So, Dr. Redstone, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. So just really quick, you can just call me Ilana. And then also just for the book, just to be clear, I'm a co-author on the book. So I wrote it with my colleague, John Villasenor. And so so it is not a solo authored book. It is a joint effort.
Yeah, sure. I will include that in the description box of the interview
Yeah.
and also a link to the book so that people can buy it if they are interested. So, let's start with perhaps some basics. What is the thesis of your book?
Yeah. So the thesis is that the conversation and discourse on campus, and although I guess I'll preface this by saying everything that we talk about in the book we sort of, because we're both academics, we focus more on campus, but everything we say really applies more broadly, and that's, if anything, true now more than ever. But the thesis of the book is that there are a set of sort of unwritten beliefs that sort of sit underneath what happens in higher education, both with respect to teaching, research, and administrative work, and that those beliefs constrain discourse, and that they are held in place, or propped up rather, by both direct and indirect effects of social media, both through sort of social media kind of mobs or whatever that we think about, but also just through the social media's ability to maintain a particular climate with a specific set of norms. And so we talk through in the book, a number of case studies and sort of outline the argument for why we think this is the case, and ultimately make some recommendations for how to move forward.
But are these attacks on freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, or both?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that I don't want to speak for my co-author, but I mean, the way that I think about it is freedom of speech. I mean, there's obviously overlap with freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry and free expression and all of those concerns. The space that we try to inhabit in this book, and certainly that I try to inhabit in the rest of my work as well, is really more kind of at the mouth of the river, in terms of how do we think about and talk about ideas. And that's I think, a much broader way of thinking about the problem. And it also means that, the things that you can count, for example, the number of shoutdowns or the number of disinvitations or, those kinds of things, while they're important, indisputably important, this problem that we're identifying exists even if there's not, even in the absence of those things. Because this is it's a question of sort of how do we talk and think about ideas and controversial issues.
But is this something that only affects American universities? Is it North America in general or even across the globe?
I think there's some variation in that. I don't claim to be an international expert on this, but from what I've read, I mean, I think that there's clearly a similar set of norms operating in places like in the UK and in Australia, and I think it's not much different in Canada. I know there's been a lot of discussion lately, for example, in the case of France, where Macron has really sort of, and among other people, has sort of taken a stand or sort of raised questions about the import of the importation of these ideas from American universities. And so I think it's probably by degrees. I think, and just to be clear, I think that, the ideas that we're talking about, questions that have to do with how we think about race and how we think about identity and how we think about inequality, I think that those are important questions to be asking. I think that those are, there are important perspectives that are brought to bear. I guess the concerning part to me is the way it's circumscribed the conversation more generally. So for example, inequality, that would be a topic that touches, that's not just a concern in the United States, that's a concern everywhere. Everybody's concerned about inequality, and rightly so to a large extent. How do we talk about inequality? Do we only talk about structural causes of inequality, and we say, the mere suggestion that there might be other factors, non-structural factors that contribute to inequality is itself sort of either racist or evidence of bigotry or whatever. That to me is not just an American problem. Questions about how do we think about identity? How do we think about who we are and what we have in common versus what separates us, and how much we lean into these identity categories? I think those are maybe global, I don't know, but they're certainly not, maybe that's overstating it, but they're certainly not limited to the United States or even the North American case. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. So, since in your book you focus on case studies, I need to ask you this question. Do we have any statistics on this issue? I mean, do we know if it's really widespread or if it's just about some isolated cases of people that get, for example, deplatformed, or some teachers that get, some professors that get fired and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So two things come to mind, and this is not, I'm going to mention these two things, and then I'm going to tell you why I don't pay that much attention to them. So one of them is the FIRE disinvitation database. So FIRE, which is, I don't know if so the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. So they have, as far as I know, they still maintain it. They maintain a database of essentially disinvitations. And which includes shout downs. And I think it has all kinds of information like the institution and what the subject was that was viewed as controversial. Like, were they talking about, race or policing, or were they talking about Palestine and Israel or abortion or whatever? And then then they also code for, I think, was the objection coming from the left or the right? And so there are statistics on that. And I think that, pre-COVID, so obviously everything's changed in the context of COVID, but pre-COVID, I think there was some evidence that those things had gone down. So for example, in 2018 or 2019, that those numbers had started to go down. Now, you don't know, those numbers could go down for more than one reason. They could go down because, everybody's sort of settled down and there's just it's less heated, or they could go down because people just sort of stopped inviting controversial speakers to come speak, right? And so those have very different implications. But so that's sort of the FIRE disinvitation piece. And then there are also, Heterodox Academy has done their campus expression survey. And so there's data on that too. Now those tend to be questions about, do you feel comfortable talking in class on this topic or that topic or whatever. And so those data also, I don't remember the percentages off the top of my head, and it varies predictably along political orientation, so that, more conservative students tend to feel more, they are self-censoring, I guess would be the term, more than students on the left. But there is evidence of self-censorship. I guess what I would come back to, so those are the two sort of data points, or the empirical points that I would that are at least first come to mind. And then what I was going to come back to is just that again, like the point that I'm trying to make is that those are important. I don't think that that's the way to make this case or to talk about this issue. At least there is a place for that. It's not what I do. It's not the space that I inhabit. So what I'm saying is, for example, how are we teaching students? So I do work inside and outside of academia, but inside of academia, how are we teaching students and preparing them to have conversations on different topics, right? On particularly controversial topics, sort of third rail topics. And that's a little bit different from does this person feel like they're self-censoring? It all sort of stems from the same place, but it's different. So, I mean, I'm happy to say more about that, but yeah, so there's there's overlap, but it's a little bit of a different framing.
I understand. So people nowadays are talking a lot about cancel culture. Does that have anything to do with your work?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the cancel culture, I mean, it all sort of, I see these as sort of like different pieces of the same kind of overarching worldview. And some of it is disimitations, and some of it is shoutdowns, and some of it's self-censorship, and some of it's cancel culture. But it's a way of defining what, I mean, some people, it's sort of Overton window kind of thing, but it's a way of defining what is inside and outside the boundaries of acceptable questions, ideas, speech, opinions, all of that. And cancel culture or canceling is sort of people who transgress or people who run afoul. In the book, we talk about people who run afoul of one of these beliefs or who sort of bump up against these things in a way that is viewed as unacceptable. And it's interesting because, I mean, sometimes there are just excesses, right? Like sometimes there are just, this person didn't deserve, like the example of the professor last year, the USC professor, I think it was, who utters the word that sounds like the N word, but it's really a word in Chinese or whatever. So there's just the examples of sort of the, eyebrow raising excess. And then there's also cases of, like people who maybe they shouldn't have said the thing. I don't know, have an example, but you could have a legitimate debate about whether someone should have said the thing that they said, or in the context that they said. I'm not, without taking a position on it, like some of them should be more open to a debate or a discussion. And, but you can't get to that point. And so you can't get to the discussion point. And so cancel culture, to me, and the way I try and talk about it more generally is, how do you want to think about these questions of when is someone exiled to the margins of society? Like, and what can they do to redeem themselves? Is there literally nothing that they can do? Nothing. There's just, that's it. They're done. I had a student in a class one time, and he said this himself, so I'm not violating it. This was a few years ago. He was from rural central Illinois, and he talked about how he, when he was in middle school, he had called another student the N-word to his face. And, he was remorseful about it, like in retelling it. He wasn't like, yeah, I did this. He was remorseful. And, and he asked the class, it was a small class, but this was the Bigots and Snowflakes class that I teach. And he asked the class, he was like, should I be canceled? And it was like, and yeah, he was in middle school, he was younger and whatever. But, again, this question of what is the path to redemption? Like, what can people do? Like, it just seems, so the idea of canceling people, that they're sort of, again, exiled for a transgression. And some people will say, and I'll stop in a minute, but some people will say, you have these examples of these sort of very well-known or famous people or celebrities or whatever who will find themselves in the crosshairs of this stuff. And people will, I think, legitimately say, like, so for example, Matt Damon, when he said something about, there being a spectrum of bad behavior from, about sexual misconduct and language and bad jokes and all this stuff. And so, I don't think we need to worry about Matt Damon's career. Like, I think he's fine. Like, he'll be just fine. But I think the broader message is not helpful. It's not helpful and it's not healthy. So I think there are real concerns without saying, in the Matt Damon case, like, it's unfair. Like, no, he'll be fine. But like, let's have a broader conversation about what the implications of that are.
Mm-hmm. But where does all of this stem from? Does it come from students, from college and university administrations, from professors, the general public?
So I know there are people who have written on this perhaps more artfully than I could explain. I mean, I know Francis Fukuyama has written a lot on this. I think that in the current moment, I mean, so one question is about what are the origins, and that's sort of, Fukuyama writes about that. And then there's a separate question, or a separate but related question about what sustains it now. And so there's obviously this social media piece that we talk about, that John and I talk about in the book, but there's also, you know, you asked this question about where does it come from? It comes from, I think largely it comes from instructors. I think it comes from administrators. I don't think it is malicious. I don't think it's some kind of conspiracy theory. I think it's well-intentioned. I think it is, in some ways, and I'm going to use this word carefully, in some ways dishonest, but dishonest only in the sense that I think particularly within higher education, universities have tried to, and understandably so, they have tried to walk this line where they try to be all things to all people. We care about protecting students. We care about free expression. Okay, well, these things they are going to bump up against each other. Like, you know, so for example, like, what do you want to do if you're a university administrator? How do you want to respond to the following statement? I think that trans women, I'm just channeling this argument, I think that trans women should not be allowed to compete in women's category sports. Is that an opinion that's covered under free expression, or is that, you know, is that harmful to the trans community? And so this idea that you're not going to have to figure out how to live in this space that's what when I say dishonest, that's what it's not it's not entirely honest. But again, like, I think in terms of where it comes from, yeah, it is a way of understanding the world that has been unquestioned, and we in the social sciences, we pass through cohort after cohort after cohort of students without giving them sort of the framework or tools to think about things differently. And we do the same thing, if not more so, with graduate students.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's another question here that is important to explore. What is the role of university? What are universities for?
Is this sort of the telos question about truth versus social justice? Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, again, so some people will talk about, you know, so the question is, you know, can you do both? Can you be oriented towards social justice and truth? You know, if you have to choose, I would think most universities should come down along the lines of truth. You know, how do you, but again, like, part of one of the arguments that people will make is that you can't really have social justice without truth, right? And so, but, you know, truth can be the way to get to truth. This is where you know, I was talking with students today about, you know, let's say I want to make a statement like, you know, men are biologically more aggressive than women. This is a statement about biology, which is sort of not, which is viewed as transgressive. And so, you know, on the quest for truth, if you make a statement like that and it runs against a sort of social justice orientation, like, again, you can't, what are you going to do? Like, and I guess I would always come down on, I think you need to lean towards truth. I don't think it's easy. But I don't see the alternative as working. I think the core concern about truth, just to not minimize it, I think is there's a real fear about what people are going to do with information. Like, so would be another example. I'll just channel the argument. You know, women are biologically better nurturers than men. Right. And so let's take that, because maybe that's an easier example. So I could then go from there to say, well, they're predisposed towards nurturing, towards an ability to nurture. So this is why, excuse me, this is why there are not that many, or not as many, female CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Aha, see, this is why. And right, so that would be, you know, rightly an offensive thing to say, but it's this idea of, well, what will happen? What will people do with the information? And to be fair, like, we have history in this space about using information for, you know, really sort of just terrible purposes, and particularly in the medical field, in the arena of medicine and things like that. And so, however, the alternative, the solution to that can't be to pretend that things aren't there. So how do you know? So again, like how do you navigate that space? How do you recognize the history while saying, look, yes, there was eugenics, and yes, there was, the Tuskegee experiments and all of these things. Yes, those things were real. At the same time, and we need to recognize that. At the same time, we can't just wish away truth if it points in a direction we don't like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. But even if truth is the goal, are there cases where the production of knowledge in academia could be influenced by politics or political struggles?
You mean politics or ideology or both?
Politics.
In what sense? You mean like actual politicians sort of reaching their hands in and shaping?
No, I mean, political ideology, basically.
Oh, okay. So I don't think there's any question. I don't think there can be any question that that's the case. And I'll give you an example. So I think one of the clearest examples is when we talk about racism. Here's why. So, if you look historically at data on racism, so if, you go back to, I don't know, you have to go back several decades and you look at questions like, how, would you object to having a neighbor who's of a different race or something like this? Or would you object if your child brought home somebody who was they were dating somebody who was of a different race? And so on all of these measures, sort of over time, since the middle of the 20th century, the objection to them went down. Right? Like, so you just saw this, like, it just went down. And so that could happen for two reasons. That could happen because attitudes change, right? And people are they're like, oh, yeah, that's whatever. Like, attitudes change and people do become less racist in that measure. It could also happen because norms change and attitudes stay the same. And it just becomes less acceptable to say, yeah, I don't want a neighbor who's of a different race. And so both of those things can be true, and you don't know. They can both be true, and you don't know. Probably there's some truth to both of them, and you don't know, is it 80-20, is it 90-10, is it 50-50? Like, you just don't know. And so what social scientists, and this is getting to the ideology in terms of research question, what social scientists end up doing is observing this and saying, well, look, these metrics have gone down in terms of how we measure racism, but, racism isn't gone. Like, it's still here. I still see it. So we must be measuring something. We're not measuring it the way we can't capture it with the same measures. And that all makes sense. And then you get into, well, how should we measure it? And so then you get into measures like, for example, support for policies like affirmative action. If you don't support, we can no longer reliably measure racism by the number of people who say that they don't want a neighbor who's of a different race. But we can ask them this question about, do you support, I'm just going to use this example, affirmative action? And probably it's safe to say that most people who are truly racist are going to answer no to that question. And what gets lost is, does that mean that everybody who answers no to that question is racist? And that gets just sort of pushed to the side. And so it's like, so this way of thinking about such an important topic that social scientists care, and rightly so, enormously about, is absolutely influenced by ideology. And I don't mean to say the causal arrow is only going one way, but yeah, it gets very, when I think the question is always sort of with a topic like that, who are you catching in your net with your definition, and who are you missing? And the sort of false positives and false negatives, but there's absolutely a place where ideology is coming in there.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are any topics or questions that should really be forbidden in universities because they go sort of over the limit of what is acceptable to explore intellectually?
I don't know. I guess a couple of thoughts on that question. One is, I think you can try to a certain extent to sort out settled questions from unsettled questions. And the settled questions, there's some that most people wouldn't wouldn't debate. Like, you don't need the geography class where people say the earth is flat, or, that the sun revolves around the earth, or these are sort of the classic examples. And those are settled questions. When you get into the realm of unsettled questions, I think that those should be open to inquiry. Like, I don't know how else we're supposed to. Now, you could say, well, there are people, the example I gave earlier about, I think it's channeling the argument, I think trans women shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's category sports. There are some people, in fact, I was listening to a podcast this morning where somebody was basically claiming that that was essentially a settled question and that there was no difference. And I was listening to it, and this is not an area of expertise, but I was like, I don't think it's a settled question. Like, I don't think we're there yet. Like, maybe we are someday, but I don't think we're there now. And so, so in terms of what should be off limits, I think that the settled questions probably should be off limits, but mostly just because why should we spend our time debating whether, the sun revolves around the earth, right? Like, no one wants to make that. We don't need people making that argument. It's not a good use of time, but then you're always going to end up in this space where who gets to decide what's the settled versus an unsettled question. And then you add on the ideological layer and people's ideological motivations for wanting to claim, for example, that it's a settled question, because if it's a settled question in the trans example, well, then there are other policy implications that flow from that. It's a mess. It's a total mess.
Mm-hmm. Is how people react to these ideas, like, for example, I mean, sometimes I read articles from Heterodox Academy, and it seems that at least on campus it's mainly a problem on the left, because there's a majority of students and administrators that are left leaning. But are the reactions to that also problematic? The reactions coming from right-wing people in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I think if you zoom out at a sort of a societal level, I think that that's true. I don't want to claim, I wouldn't feel comfortable claiming symmetry, because I think that that's just I don't know, that seems like a bit of a strong statement to make. I don't know. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily symmetrical. My area and my experience is mostly with the way this plays out on the left, just because most of where I am is in I'm in left-leaning academia, and I'm in a discipline within academia. I'm in a left-leaning discipline. And so I'm sort of, because of where I'm situated, that's more of what I see. But I'll also say that, I see students who don't realize what they've not been taught. Like, they don't realize that not because they're stupid, like they have literally never sort of come across the idea that, oh, there actually might be, for example, principled reasons to want to de-emphasize race, or to not lean into racialized explanations and prescriptions for things. There might be morally valid reasons to do that, in addition to racist reasons. And so no one has ever really, I come across students all the time who are just, and it's not necessarily that they are opposed to the idea. Some of them are, but not all of them. It's more just like, I never thought of that. Like, no one's ever said that before. And it's just like, oh, and then we send them off into the world, and it makes no sense. It just really doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, so we've been focusing on universities, but is it the case that these ideas move from universities to politics, for example, to the wider society?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and is it, again, sort of, is it always flowing outward from universities, or is it, there's some because obviously even faculty and instructors and people within a university community have outside lives as well, that they bring in. So I'm sure, again, there are feedback loops there, but no, I don't think there's any question that it goes into broader society. I mean, and you can see it in the book we write about, Silicon Valley and we write about the media. But it's even broader than that. It's sort of these ideas about, again, like a lot of it has to do with race and identity. I mean, I think it's in, outside of higher education, it's certainly present in schools more generally. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear actually what this is like in Portugal, but certainly in the US in the K through 12 experience, it's present there too. It's present in workplaces. And so I think we've done a really poor job, and this relates to some of the work I try to do outside of academia, but we've done a really poor job of figuring out how to navigate that space. Sort of recognize, like take a workplace, for example, nobody wants a workplace where people are just running roughshod over other people's feelings, like being disrespectful and using epithets and slurs, and nobody wants this place. And so that's almost a caricature, but how do you think about offense and harm and intent and people's feelings and identity and division and unity and all of these questions that are increasingly playing themselves out in the workplace? And, in terms of places that people congregate and people have repeated interactions, there is an incentive to do better and to get it right. And the thing is that we can do better and we can get it right. There are ways to do it. It's not a, snap your fingers. There's no magic to it, but it is about sort of thinking through some questions, thinking through what we know, thinking through the implications of staying on a particular path. I mean, we absolutely can do better, and we should do better.
Mm-hmm. Do social media contribute to this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I should say, I'm not a big social media person. Yeah. For a couple of reasons. One is I just don't like the pressure to be pithy and quick in however many, some limited number of characters. I'd just much rather talk to people. But also I just feel yeah, I mean, I'll skip my other reasons, but so I'm not a big I do lurk a little bit, but I'm not on it a whole lot. But even in my own sort of small lurking way, it's very clear, like that you forget that you are being fed based on this algorithm. And I guess you can minimize it. To the extent that you follow people. I'm thinking of Twitter mostly. To the extent that you follow people of a wide range of political perspectives and things like that, I suppose you can minimize it. I'm not sure how many people actually do that. I think that the pressure that comes from the threat of a social media call out is real. I think people lose jobs, they have their reputations trashed, when you don't get a chance. Part of the problem is that once that happens, you can't do anything about it. It's just a runaway train. And what are you going to say? No, I'm not a racist bigot. Well, yes, you are. That's exactly what a racist bigot would say. And now you're in a circle. You're in a swamp. And so I think all people, I know there's been research on this, the kinds of tweets that get more likes and more retweets or the more extreme. And so all of the incentives are they're sort of skewed in that sense. And what we need is conversation. And that's exactly what we don't get on social media. You get, quick, you get sharp, you get zingers, you get, I want to get the thing that has a lot of likes and get the blue check and get this, and it's not helpful for where we need to be. That's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. But do you think, of course you said you're not a specialist on social media, but do you think that it exacerbates some of these problems?
Yeah, I do, because I think it gives one of the things about, and again, I'm going to focus on Twitter, but, one of the great things about Twitter is that it democratizes and, it gives everyone a platform. It also gives everyone a platform, and so the fact that you can have somebody who just says, if your tweet or the thing that you said or the thing that you did catches sort of the wrong person's attention on the wrong day, and then suddenly you have, hate mail, and you have so does it exacerbate it? Absolutely, because not only through the obvious sort of algorithms, which lots of people have written about, but also just the whole mood and tenor and social norms that are created about how we talk about things, whether it's, the use of the term white supremacy, or it's the use of the term transphobic, or all of these things get thrown around in a way that absolutely changes the nature of the conversation. And you can have a very small number of people with an outsized amount of power to shape the conversation.
Mm-hmm. But are there any disciplines that are more targeted than others?
Yeah, I mean, any discipline where you're talking about social problems is going to be ground zero, which is why sociology is, we're literally in the middle of it. So, we're talking about inequality and identity and social problems. Having said that, so a couple of thoughts. One is that it affects a lot more than just, for example, we have whatever we have in my department, 200 majors or something like that. It's not just the majors in this discipline, because there are students who pass through these classes from all over campus. And this is not unique to the University of Illinois. This is on every college campus. So there's a huge reach. And then in terms of other disciplines, clearly any discipline that touches these questions about anything that relates to inequality and identity and all of these different things. But there's also, there's all these sort of well-known examples of people making charges about how math is racist and physics is racist. And, and so, yes, that everything should be sort of latched on to this idea of anti-racism and taking up, and everything is politicized, And so I don't know if there are disciplines that are untouched at this point. There might be. It's clear there's clearly a range. I don't think that people in, some of the engineering departments probably deal with this nearly as much as people in the social sciences or in the humanities, just because the subject matter, but I don't know that they're totally exempt either. And part of that, and to a certain extent, that has to do with there are some institutions who have, who have different regulations about things, and we talk about in the book, things like diversity statements and things like that, which obviously those are sort of at the superordinate level that touch all parts of campus.
But does this problem also affect research? I'm asking you that because, okay, maybe I'm a little bit biased there, but since I have people on the show with very controversial ideas, controversial from the viewpoint of left-leaning people, let's say, for example, biologists, evolutionary psychologists, ideas that are very, very controversial, and they seem that they are able to keep up with their research without any sort of, at least, major problems. So what do you think about it?
Right. So this would be the argument that, actually this is, a tempest in a teapot and people are going about their research and there's not really a big deal. I don't know. I guess that's a good thing. To the extent that there are people doing controversial work and they're not subject to any kind of uproar, that's great. I guess, but this kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. That's obviously great. Yes, people should be able to do their research and not be doing it, providing it's sort of worthy or worthy research endeavor. They shouldn't be doing it under sort of fear of a social media mob or fear of cancellation or anything. But going back to what I said at the beginning, there's still a problem. There is still a problem. Even if that were all true, there is still a problem in how we are, in the way we're framing and having these discussions, having conversations about these topics. I see it every day. And so that's great if what you're saying is true. That is an unambiguously good thing. but the problem that I'm talking about is still very real.
Mm-hmm. So, in your work, you also talk about viewpoint diversity. What is this about?
So I really hate these terms. Like, I hate all of them. I hate political polarization. I hate viewpoint diversity. I hate ideological diversity. I just think they're all kind of gag-inducing, like overused, to the point of being almost meaningless. But I don't have a better term. I don't have better language. And so I'll just preface my comments with that. So viewpoint diversity, I think, to me, is literally allowing for different points of view on equal moral footing. So on questions about, so for example, if you take, I don't know, the top, identity, fairness, I'm trying to think, identity, fairness,
It's yeah, it's probably it's sorry, I don't know the diversity, inclusivity.
Oh, right. So you're right. And diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what I'm right. But what
Yeah,
I'm thinking about is, yes. So you're talking about DEI initiatives. But what I'm talking about when I think of
yeah.
viewpoint diversity is actually, if you go, let's just take identity and fairness to be as examples. Part of what's been lost is that there are actually, we think there are different ways to think about fairness. So, for example, let's take the case of race-based college admissions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you could have somebody make the argument that what's fair is actually to take into account the barriers that members of historically marginalized groups have faced in accessing opportunities, that it's fair to take that into account, right? That's a reasonable argument to make. You could also take the example of, you could also, in the same subject, you could say, well, what's actually fair is to evaluate every applicant based on their own merit, based on their own qualifications, right? Get away from this idea of sort of collective guilt and whatever else, but that's fair. Both of those positions can claim the mantle of fairness. And so that's, when you think about viewpoint diversity, those are two different ways. They're using the same word, but it's actually means something very different. The example with identity would be something like, how do we think about who we are? How do we think, identity is the most important thing about us, our race, ethnicity, gender, identity, expression, etc., and the rest is the most important thing about us. Can I just be, a professor who loves ice cream, or do I have to be a middle-aged white woman, et cetera, et cetera? So how do we think about identity? People actually think about these things differently. What are the implications of assuming that everyone thinks about it the same way? And so when I think, this is going back to your question about viewpoint diversity, that's what I mean, is that there are actually, and you could go down the list, but there are actually a lot of these topics where you could have different perspectives on equal moral footing, and that's gotten lost.
Mm-hmm. But are these issues historically novel, or have they been occurring throughout different periods in time?
That's a good question. It came up in one of my classes this morning too. I don't, my sense is that things have certainly shifted. Now, although I guess I think things have shifted. I don't know. I think the reasons for that are complicated. I think they have to do with, and again, there are lots of people have written on this, but I think they have to do with the fact that things have gotten a lot better in a lot of ways, which I know is itself a controversial assertion to make. It doesn't mean things are perfect, and that we don't have work to do, but just that things have gotten better. And so I think that's part of it. I think as other countries, including in Europe, are seeing, I think some of it has to do with diversity. And the changes that diversity brings, if you look at in this country, the way immigration changed in the second half of the 20th century, in the way after 1965, the 1965 legislation, and sort of what that meant for changing our immigration system and opening it up to countries that had not been very well represented in terms of their origin or as origin countries previously, and sort of what that means 2 generations later. You know, I think on balance, it's a great thing. But you know, are there pieces of where we are today that trace back to the diversity that you know, that piece of it? Yeah, maybe, I don't know. And then also just how we think about rights, how we think about equality, how we think about all of these topics seems to have shifted, and then it continues. It seems like the feedback loop is that they're because of the lack of viewpoint diversity on a lot of these topics, the feedback loop is that they get calcified. Like, so we can't talk about differences between men and women in any context other than being, you know, based on gender roles. And so then that's all we can talk about. We can only talk about this thing over here because the suggestion of something else, I'm just using that as an example, the suggestion of something else is to, you know, excuse the fact that, you know, women are not, are you know, discriminated against, or not treated the way, in some ways not treated the way they should be in the workplace, and or basically like that it's somehow not recognizing that there's still work to do. And I know this is why Steven Pinker, I can't remember where he wrote this, but he makes this argument that, you know, this is essentially why equality has to be a moral principle, not something that we sort of demand equal representation in every, you know, sort of equal outcomes, for, you know, equal opportunity, but that it has to be a moral principle, because you can't, the assertions that you have to make otherwise, you know, that there are no differences in biology, that there are, you know, that there are, it's in the male and female example, you end up getting lost. You end up sort of getting lost in the weeds of the, like, you just end up drifting far from the point of which is sort of what kind of society do we want? Where do we want to be? How can we get there? And we don't need to be lost in some of these arguments that aren't helpful. So again, that gets back to sort of the equality as a moral principle. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense. Yeah.
It'll make sense to your audience, because sometimes I lose my train of thought.
No problem at all. So, I mean, since we're also dealing here with political and moral problems, like, for example, when people are fighting for social justice or something like that, they are, of course, dealing with moral questions. So do you think that it could be the case that at least in some of these cases, in the future, they will be right? I mean, they will be vindicated by history, and we are simply in a moral framework where we are unable to really see that these questions should be dealt with in the way the social justice warriors, let's say, put them.
Oh God, I think I love this question. Yeah, basically, I mean, and you know, my co-author, so John and I have talked about this. It's like, well, we've asked ourselves, like, and when we were writing the book, it was like, well, what if we're just wrong? Like, what if we're just, you know, 30 years from now, we're just sort of the backward facing, knuckle dragging, you know, like monsters. And I don't have the answer for that. I mean, all I can do is say, I mean, I guess like there was one other point that I'll make, but my intuition is that that's not right. And all you can do is sort of do the work that you think is meaningful, and sort of do what you think is right and what you think is best for, I mean, to the extent that you're so inclined. And I guess I'm also, you know, in the position where I have a job where I can do this. And I mean, sort of like you can do this full time. I mean, I don't do interviews, but I mean, I can spend 12 hours a day thinking about this. I don't have some other job that I have to do. And I sort of squeeze this into my personal time. The other thing that I would say about, so I guess the first thing is, yes, in the long run, who knows? I don't think that's true, but I've certainly wondered the same thing. Like, am I just wrong? Like, and will I be sort of, yes, the sort of Neanderthal looking back? I don't know. And then the other But the other point that I would say is that my intuition on this, particularly around the identity stuff, is I don't think it's going to last. I think, and now I'll tell you that I think that the time horizon on when it will sort of shift to something else, I think I will probably be dead and buried by that point. But I think that the reason I think it won't last is because I think that as you have generations who are more and more rooted in this country, I don't think people like to view themselves or or be viewed by others as primarily what they like, their race and ethnicity and their sexual, like, I don't think that's, I don't know if it's a defense mechanism or whatever, but at the end of the day, I don't think people want to be seen for who they are. And so I think you're going to have, in the medium to long term, I think you're going to have groups themselves who are sort of shrugging some of this off and saying, I'm more than just my group membership. And I don't want to identify this way. And, you know, so I don't think that in the long run, but again, it could be, I'm 48 and it could be way after I'm dead and buried. So.
Yeah. Okay, so just one last topic to explore here. What do you think would be the best solutions to deal with this problem on campus?
I think that, you know, I think that the work that I don't think I'm any sort of magician. I do think that the work that I've been doing it works. I think that talking with students, I mean, I don't spend so much time talking with instructors, but certainly talking with students, like, there is a way to have this conversation that is about asking questions and that is not threatening and is not aggressive. What happens is if you go in, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but if you go in and you talk to people, it could be students or it could be anybody else, and you're telling them, like, look, here's why what you're doing is wrong. Here's why racializing, it's divisive. Here's da 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 da. And then you sort of give them the list of reasons. It doesn't, all they're going to do, and understandably, it's sort of a human tendency, they're going to look for reasons to prove you wrong. Like, it's not, that's what I would do. I mean, I would be like, well, no, here's 17 reasons why you're wrong. And so, but talking through questions, and I'll give you, I know we're running out of time, but just, here's an example, like, with respect, and again, affirmative action comes up often as an example because it's sort of universally understood, at least the basics of it. You know, questions would be like, why might somebody oppose affirmative action? Okay, well, because they're racist. Okay, fair enough. Why else might they oppose affirmative action? Is there anything else on that list other than racism? Okay, well, you know, sure, I guess, okay, here's 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever things that might be on that list other than racism. So if all you know is that the person is opposed to affirmative action, can you tell which of these things, which reason is their reason for being opposed to affirmative action? Well, no, you can't really tell. But racism is on that list along with these other things. And so then the question is, well, what does it mean to get it wrong? Like, what if you're wrong? You know, what if you're wrong a lot? Like, I don't know if you're wrong a lot, but let's just ask the question. What if you are wrong a lot? Like, what does that mean? And so I'm not telling anyone that they're wrong. Like, I'm not. And so I think that going back to your point about solutions, like, I do think there's a way to do this. I'm trying to engage more with people. I've worked with a couple of different organizations and trying to move things forward. I did put out these, I don't know if you saw the videos that I did. There's a video series that's called Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes. And so that is just a free video series on YouTube. It's designed to be sort of a starting point for conversations. Instructors have used it in class. You know, people use it for different things. So that, I don't mean to say that I'm the solution, but I can only speak to what I'm doing. But I think that the broader solution has to be a willingness to sort of consider different perspectives, to consider different perspectives on equal moral footing, to, like, there's a lot more to say, but yeah, I think there are ways to do better. I don't think it's easy, but I think it's doable.
Mm-hmm. So, apart from the book, before we go, where can people find you on the internet? And would you like to mention any other places or sources?
Yeah, I mean, the website where I sort of dump everything is it's diverseperspectivesconsulting.com. And so on there, I talk about some of the consulting work that I do, the workshops that I do, the book, the videos, there's contact information. So maybe someday I am on social media. I just don't do much with it. So yeah, so but I would say that on the website, that's where there's pretty much everything and links to things that I've written. Yeah, so that would be a good place to go.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview down below. And guys, again, the book is Unassailable Ideas, How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education. Ilana, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. Please consider supporting the show. This show depends entirely on your support. So head to patreon.com/the dissenter and consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, I also have links to PayPal in the description box of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, KARIN, LIETZCKE, and BLANCHETTE, LARSEN, GUERREIRO, Francis Fordans, FREDRIK, SUNDE, RICARDO, VLADIMIRO, HEALY, Alan KESSEL, OLAF, Alex, JONATHAN, VISSER, JAKOB, KLINKBY, Matthew WHITINGBIRD, ARNAUD Wolf, Tim Hollisey, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Muller, Herbert GINTIS, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Nieberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Roy Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormer, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, JW, João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila DEZA-ARAUJO, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Muller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.